There is a kind of humiliation that doesn't announce itself with noise. It arrives quietly the way a drought does, not all at once, but in increments so small you almost convince yourself it isn't happening. One dry week. Then two. Then you look up one morning and the creek bed is white bone and cracked mud, and you understand that something permanent has shifted. Elias Cutter understood that kind of humiliation better than most men his age. He was 34 years old and owned 27 acres of desert scrubland in the Sonoran basin that he had purchased at a county auction for $25.11. The 11 cents being, as he later told me, the most important part. "Anyone can round up to $1, he said. 11 cents means you counted every coin you had. He wasn't celebrated for buying that land. He was laughed at. His brother-in-law called it dirt with ambitions. The asser in Tucson told him, without lowering his voice, that the ground was too alkaline for crops, too rocky for cattle, too far from water for anything living to consider it home. The banker who'd taken his mother's sewing money in partial collateral for the deed didn't bother looking up from his ledger when he handed over the paperwork. He just said, "Don't come back expecting sympathy." And Elias didn't. What he did instead was the kind of thing that looks like madness until, suddenly, it doesn't. I was there for part of it. Not all of it. I arrived late, the way I always seem to arrive at things that matter, slightly breathless and already behind. But I kept my journal, same as I always do, and I wrote down what I saw with the same stubborn precision I'd been using since my first season writing dispatch for the Territorial Survey Office. Some habits are harder to break than bad land deals. This is what I recorded. I first saw Elias Cutter on a Wednesday in late April, which matters because Wednesday was Mail Day in Pima Junction, and Mail Day was the one occasion when everyone in a 30-mile radius found some excuse to be in town at the same time. You could learn more about a community's social architecture in 2 hours on Mail Day than in 2 weeks of ordinary observation. Who spoke to whom? Who pretended not to see whom? Whose letters were handed over with pity and whose with envy? Elias Cutter's letters were handed over with something that didn't quite fit either category. The postmaster, a compact man named Beale with a permanent squint from decades of reading fine print, passed Elias's envelope with 2 fingers rather than 1, the way you'd hand something to a child you weren't sure would drop it. The envelope was thin, official-looking. Elias took it without opening it, tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat, and turned away from the counter before Beale had a chance to say whatever he'd clearly prepared to say. I noticed the exchange because I notice things. It's not a virtue, necessarily. My field supervisor, a geologist named Hargrove who had the emotional range of a surveying rod, used to tell me I paid too much attention to people and not enough to formations. He wasn't wrong. But formations don't make choices, and choices are what I've always found most worth recording. I'd come to Pima Junction to file survey amendments for a section of land in the basin's eastern ridge, bureaucratic work, the kind that takes 40 minutes and feels like it takes 4 hours, and I had 2 days to kill before the return stage. I had my journal. I had my habit of watching. And I had, as it happened, a view from the town's only dining counter, directly facing the hitching post, where Elias Cutter tied a mule that was not a mule. It was a donkey. A small one, gray-brown with a white muzzle and one ear that didn't quite track the same direction as the other. It stood at the hitching post with the particular stillness of an animal that has decided to be somewhere fully, without reservation. Most horses fidget. This donkey simply existed in its spot with a philosophical completeness that I found, absurdly, a little moving. I wrote that down, small donkey philosophical bearing, one ear independent of the other. Elias Cutter went about his business with the efficiency of a man who'd learned not to linger in places where lingering invited conversation. He bought feed from the mercantile, not much, I noticed, just what a man alone might need for a few weeks. He paid in coin, counting it twice before he set it on the counter. He stopped at the water trough, let the donkey drink for a long time, then filled 2 canvas bags from the well and strapped them to the donkey's back alongside the feed sack. No one spoke to him in a warm way. A few men nodded, the minimal transaction of acknowledgement that stops just short of actual greeting. A woman with a basket turned slightly as he passed, not quite avoiding him, but not quite meeting his eyes either. There was a shapelessness to the way people related to him, like he occupied a social category they hadn't fully agreed on, not quite pariah, not quite neighbor. I finished my coffee and went outside because the air in the dining counter had gone stale, and because I wanted a closer look at the donkey, which I told myself was the actual reason, and which was only partly true. The donkey regarded me with one of its independently mobile ears. "He won't bite," said a voice to my left. Elias Cutter had returned from somewhere, the Assier's office, I learned later, for a conversation he'd been having monthly for 8 months with the same disappointing outcome. He was slightly taller than I'd expected, with the kind of leanness that comes not from constitution but from circumstance. His hands were extraordinary, broad-palmed, with fingers that seemed slightly too long, like they'd been stretched by years of reaching for things at the edge of their grasp. "Didn't think he would," I said. "He looks too contented to bother." Elias looked at the donkey with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. The way a man looks at something he loves in public when he isn't sure whether love is the appropriate face to show. "His name's Archimedes," he said. "That's a considerable name for a small animal." "He earned it." He didn't elaborate immediately. He untied the donkey and ran one of those long-fingered hands along the animal's neck, a gesture so habitual it barely registered as affection, which meant it was entirely affection. "You with the survey office?" I said I was. "Eastern Ridge section." I confirmed it. "You'll be filing the amendments on the Tanner parcel." "Adjacent to it, yes." He nodded slowly, with the absorption of someone calculating something they've been calculating for a long time. "What's the moisture reading on the subsurface layer?" "East-facing slope below the limestone shelf." I stared at him. He met my stare with steady patience. I don't typically have that level of specificity in my. "It's in the secondary report," he said. "Page 41 or thereabouts. The surveyors always note it. They just don't flag it because it reads as negligible at surface grade." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "How do you know what the surveyors flag?" "I read everything," he said simply. He clicked his tongue once, a quiet, private sound, and Archimedes began to walk, and Elias Cutter walked with him, and in that way both of them left me standing at the hitching post with an unanswered question, and I realized, a genuine and uncomfortable curiosity. I found him at the edge of town 20 minutes later, not because I'd followed him exactly, but because the road out of Pima Junction toward the basin only went one direction for the first half-mile, and I had to return to the survey office anyway, and Archimedes walked at a pace that made following look like coincidence. "The subsurface moisture," I said, pulling alongside him. "Why does it matter to you?" He didn't seem surprised I'd come back. "You looked at the survey maps for the basin section," he said. It wasn't a question. "The ridge section, eastern." "Close enough." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were almost structural. He handed it to me without breaking stride. "Sketch map. Mine, don't lose it." I unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn topographical rendering of what I recognized as the basin floor, rough but surprisingly precise, with contour lines and annotations in a handwriting so small I had to hold it close to read. He'd marked several spots with a symbol I didn't immediately recognize, a small circle with a downward line, like a divining rod stylized to its essence. "What are these markers?" "Locations where Archimedes stopped." I looked at the donkey. The donkey's rogue ear swiveled mildly. "The donkey chose these spots." "He stops at them," Elias said, with the careful verbal precision of someone who'd been mocked for this belief before and had learned to present it as observation rather than claim. "He stops, he plants his feet, and he won't move for 3 to 5 minutes. Every time. Same spots, roughly. Not every walk, but often enough." "And you think?" "I don't think anything," he said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man who has had this conversation with skeptics enough times to know where it leads. "I record what he does. The rest is data." We walked in silence for a quarter-mile. The road narrowed and the scrub thickened on either side, creosote and palo verde and the occasional saguaro standing at attention in the afternoon light. The heat was real but not brutal. Late April in the basin had a tolerance to it, a kind of negotiated warmth. "How long have you owned the land?" I asked. 8 months and 4 days. "And how many times have people told you it's worthless?" He thought about it. I stopped counting at 30. Does it bother you? The long pause that followed wasn't the pause of someone searching for an answer. It was the pause of someone deciding how much of an answer to give. My father, he said finally, spent 19 years trying to prove he wasn't worthless. He was a good man. He worked harder than anyone I knew, and he died with nothing because he spent all his effort proving a thing to people who'd already decided the answer. He paused. I'm not interested in proving anything. I'm interested in the land. But if the land is what they say it is, then I'll know that eventually, he said. But I'll know it because I tested it, not because someone told me from a distance. We reached the boundary of his property an hour later. There was no fence, no money for fencing, I gathered, just a wooden stake with a strip of red cloth tied to it, and the survey numbers painted on in careful black letters that had already faded somewhat in the Sonoran sun. Elias stopped at the stake the way you stop at a door, with a slight gathering of self that suggested the transition mattered. Archimedes stopped too, planted all 4 feet, ears forward. He always does that at the boundary, Elias said, and something crossed his face that I can only describe as private satisfaction. The expression of a man watching evidence accumulate toward a conclusion he hasn't yet allowed himself to state aloud. I stood on the edge of 27 acres of alkaline scrubland in the late afternoon light and tried to see what Elias Cutter saw when he looked at it. I couldn't, not yet. But I wrote it down anyway, something here. Not sure what, donkey seems certain. The survey office held me in Pima Junction for 4 days rather than 2, paperwork complications, a missing signature, the particular bureaucratic inertia of territorial offices in the 1880s. I used the extra time the way I'd learned to use unexpected time, by going where my curiosity pointed. Curiosity pointed at Elias Cutter's 27 acres. He'd told me without exactly inviting me that he camped at the property's northwest corner, near a formation of pink granite that provided shade in the afternoon and windbreak in the evening. I rode out on my second extra day, carrying my survey compass and a notebook and the thin legitimacy of professional interest. The camp was spare. A canvas lean-to against the granite, a fire ring of careful stones, a water barrel that had been filled from the bags Archimedes carried. Elias had a cot of sorts, a canvas stretcher suspended between 2 iron rods, and a wooden crate that served as both table and filing cabinet, its top covered with papers held down by a flat stone. He was not at camp when I arrived. Archimedes was. The donkey was tethered loosely to a creosote bush and appeared to be contemplating the middle distance with complete equanimity. He acknowledged my arrival by shifting his weight from 3 legs to 4, which felt, in the moment, like genuine courtesy. I sat on a rock and waited, which gave me time to look at the land in a way I hadn't in the previous day's brief visit. The basin floor here was not featureless. That was the first adjustment I had to make to my initial impression. From a distance, and from the attitude of every person in Pima Junction I'd spoken to, the land read as uniform, just scrub and rock and alkali-dusted earth going nowhere at consistent altitude. Up close, it had a more complicated texture. There were depressions, not obvious ones, but small, sheltered places where the ground was a different shade of brown, where the soil had a finer grain and a different smell. I'd spent enough time around geologists to recognize the color of clay-rich earth when I saw it. I was crouching near one of these depressions, rubbing a pinch of soil between my fingers when Elias returned. He came on foot from the eastern end of the property, with Archimedes's tether rope looped over one wrist. He'd apparently untethered the animal and taken him for a walk while I wasn't looking. He saw me crouching in the depression and stopped at a distance, reading the situation. "Subsurface clay lens," he said from 12 feet away. "About 6 inches down in that spot. Closer to 4 in the northeast quadrant." I looked up. "How deep does it run?" "Don't know yet. That's what I'm working on." He came forward and crouched beside me, picking up a bit of the surface soil and feeling it with the same unconscious precision he applied to everything. "Clay lens can hold water. If it runs deep enough and the geometry's right, you've got a catchment basin, seasonal at minimum, possibly perennial if there's upwelling. The alkalinity is a top-layer condition. Clay below reads different. I've been taking samples." He stood and went to the crate, lifting the flat stone, and produced a series of small cloth bags, each labeled in his miniature handwriting. "I can't afford a proper assay for all of them, So I've been doing what I can with a kit from the mercantile, and what I remember from a book on soil chemistry I read in the Tucson library. You read a book on soil chemistry? 3 times, he said, without embarrassment. The library only charges 5 cents for a full day's access to the reference section. I went on slow days. I looked at the row of sample bags. There were 11 of them. How long have you been collecting these? Since the 3rd week after I bought the property. Has anyone else seen them? The Asir saw 2 of them, told me the methodology was amateur and the conclusions were speculative. Were they? Probably, he said it without deflation. That's why I kept doing it. Amateur methodology still produces data. You just have to be careful about what you conclude from it. He set the bags back carefully and replaced the stone. What conclusions are you drawing from that depression? I told him what I'd observed, the soil color, the grain size, the smell, which was slightly more mineral and less alkali-sharp than the surface material nearby. He listened without expression, and then he reached into the crate and pulled out a second sketch map. This one marked with small circles like the first, but with dates written beside each one. Archimedes stopped at that spot on February 11th, he said, pointing to the depression I'd been examining. First time he stopped there. He's stopped there 4 times since. We looked at each other across the crate of sample bags, and the sketch map, and the question neither of us had yet said aloud. Have you talked to anyone with actual geological training? I asked. I wrote to the university in Tucson. They sent back a form letter. What kind of form letter? The kind that says, "Thank you for your inquiry," without saying anything else. I sat back on my heels and looked out across the 27 acres of scrubland in the long light of the afternoon. Archimedes had returned to his contemplative 4-legged stance and was facing east, both ears forward, into whatever private signal he was perpetually receiving. The survey office has a consulting geologist, I said slowly. Retired. He lives in Pima Junction, actually, out on the Calhoun Road. His name is Prewitt. He's not, I paused, choosing my words. He is not a warm man, but he knows what he knows. What does he charge? I don't actually know. I've only spoken to him twice, both times on official business, but I could. I wasn't sure why I was offering this. I told myself it was professional interest. The land use implications were relevant to survey work. That was mostly true. I could introduce you if you want. He might look at your samples. Elias was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something other than a pause. Why, he said. Why what? Why would you do that? It was a reasonable question. I'd known this man for less than 2 days. I had no professional obligation here. And yet there was something in the arrangement of his evidence, the careful bags, the annotated maps, the monthly visits to an Asir who dismissed him without looking up, that felt like a claim on attention. Not on sympathy exactly, something more rigorous than sympathy. Because, I said, you're doing something methodical and they're dismissing you without method. That bothers me more than it probably should. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I'd later learn was his version of gratitude, contained, unconvinced of its own appropriateness, but real. All right, he said. Archimedes turned his rogue ear in our direction. We went to see Prewitt the following morning. Dr. Marcus Prewitt had retired from the Arizona Territorial Geological Survey 4 years earlier, at the age of 61, following a professional disagreement of apparently epic proportions that no one in Pima Junction had witnessed directly, but everyone referenced as though they had. He lived in a house that was primarily a collection of geological samples, arranged with scholarly precision around a man who sat at the center of them like a spider in a very organized web. He received us in his study, which smelled of pipe tobacco, iron-rich dust, and a faint undertone of something sulfurous that probably had an innocent geological explanation. He was a compact man with a white beard trimmed to professional severity and eyes of a pale gray that gave nothing away and took everything in. He did not greet Elias warmly. He did not greet anyone warmly. But he looked at the sample bags with the specific intensity of a man who cannot help being interested in data regardless of its source. These are labeled by location and date, he said, holding the first bag up to the light. Yes, said Elias. And you collected them yourself? Yes. With what tools? A trowel and a glass jar. The jar was for the ones from deeper collection, to avoid contamination from the surface layer. A silence in which something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in Prewitt's expression. "Show me the map," he said. Elias produced both sketch maps, the topographical one with the contour lines and the dated one with the circle markers. Prewitt laid them side by side on his desk and leaned over them without touching them, reading them the way a scholar reads a text, with focused and slightly aggressive attention. "What's this symbol?" he said, pointing to the downward line circles. Elias hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Locations where my donkey stopped," he said. Prewitt looked up. "He stops at certain spots consistently," Elias said, in the same flat, observation language tone he'd used with me. "I record the locations and dates. I'm not drawing conclusions from it specifically, but it correlates with the clay lens deposits." Prewitt's expression moved through several internal registrations that I couldn't quite follow. He looked back at the map. "The northeast quadrant," he said. "What depth did you find clay?" "And you're on the basin floor here," he tapped the map, "not the ridge." "Correct." Prewitt was quiet for a very long time. He opened 2 of the sample bags and smelled them, actually smelled them, the way a baker smells dough, with professional assessment, and then he set them down with a care that was different from his previous handling. "Come back Friday," he said. "I'll have done something with these by Friday." Elias looked at him. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing yet," Prewitt said. "Ask me Friday." We left the house and walked back toward the main road in the warm morning air, Archimedes between us, both ears now tracking the same direction as though he'd resolved whatever navigational disagreement they'd been having. "That went better than I expected," I said. "Yes," said Elias. He said it with the same careful neutrality he applied to everything that mattered too much. But his hand on Archimedes' tether was slightly looser than usual, and there was something in the way he walked, a very small, very controlled unclenching, that I recognized from my own experience of having an unexpected door open after a long time in the corridor, as the careful management of hope. I wrote it down that night. Something here, the soil knows it, the donkey knows it, and tonight, for the first time, I think Elias Cutter is letting himself consider the possibility that he might be right. The most dangerous thing, maybe, that a man like him can do. Friday arrived in Pima Junction with a wind from the south and a sky the color of old pewter, not threatening rain exactly, but making the suggestion. I'd extended my stay at the boarding house on reasons I told myself were professional, and that were by that point not primarily professional at all. Hargrove would have told me I was wasting time on people again. He would have been correct. I had stopped caring. Elias met me at the survey office at 7 in the morning with Archimedes and an expression of compressed quietness that I'd learned was his baseline state when something important was pending. We walked to Prewitt's house together without much conversation. Archimedes walked between us with his characteristic philosophical completeness. The front door of Prewitt's house was open, which was apparently unusual. He met us in the doorway, which was more unusual still, and gestured us in without ceremony to his study, where his desk had been cleared of everything except the 2 sketch maps, now pinned flat with small geological hammer weights, and 6 of the sample bags opened, with their contents spread on glass slides I didn't remember seeing on the first visit. Prewitt did not offer us chairs. He stood behind his desk with his arms at his sides, which I recognized as his version of a formal posture, and he looked at Elias Cutter with an expression that had changed substantially from Wednesday. "Sit down," he said, remembering the chairs after a moment. We sat. "I'm going to tell you what I found," Prewitt said, "and then I'm going to tell you what I don't know, and then I'm going to tell you what I think you should do. In that order. Don't ask questions until I've finished." Elias nodded. "The clay lens is real." Prewitt put his finger on the map on the northeast quadrant circle. "This location and this one," he moved his finger to the depression I'd examined, "show a double-layer clay formation at depths consistent with what you'd expect from a Pleistocene-era alluvial deposit. The upper layer is interrupted, which is why the surface reads alkaline and useless. But below the break, approximately 8 to 14 inches based on your samples, the clay is intact and dense." He paused for a breath. "Dense enough to hold water." The silence in the study lasted 4 full seconds. "How much water?" Elias said. "That depends on the geometry of the lens. If it extends, and I have reason to believe it does, based on the gradient your map shows. You could be looking at a seasonal retention basin of considerable size. Which means, Pruitt stopped himself, reassembled his language into something more careful. Which means that if someone knew how to work with the formation rather than against it, you could have year-round water access from subsurface wells at the northeast end of your property. Elias was very still. "What kind of water?" he said, "not how much, I noticed. What kind?" Pruitt almost smiled. "Good question, filtered through clay, which removes most of the alkali." The samples from those two locations read significantly lower alkalinity than the surface. Not pristine, but... He picked up one of the glass slides and held it to the window light. "Better than most of the creek water in this basin. Certainly better than the alkaline surface reads that the Assyr was testing." "The Assyr was testing surface samples," Elias said. "Yes. He never tested subsurface." "No." The weight of 8 months of dismissal moved across Elias Cutter's face in a single expression that lasted less than 2 seconds, and was gone. He reassembled to neutrality with the practiced speed of a man who has learned not to feel things in public prematurely. "What don't you know?" he said. Pruitt respected this. I could see it in the way he continued. "I don't know the full lateral extent of the lens. Your samples suggest it runs northeast to southwest, which would be consistent with the old drainage patterns in this basin. There used to be a much larger wash running through here before the geological event that shifted the gradient. But I'm working from your sample collection, which is," he paused, "surprisingly systematic for an amateur collection, but still incomplete." "What would a complete survey cost?" "More than $25.11. Pruitt said it without cruelty. He'd looked up the deed. Of course he had. "Approximately what figure?" "For a proper subsurface survey with bore samples at 8 locations, $400 minimum. Could be twice that depending on what the bore samples show, and whether you need a hydrological assessment." Elias absorbed this. I did the arithmetic in my head without meaning to, and came up with nothing encouraging. "What do you think I should do?" Elias said, third item on the list. Pruitt sat back in his chair with the look of a man who had promised himself he'd be clinical about this, and was finding it more complicated than anticipated. "I think," he said carefully, "that the people who told you this land was worthless were working with incomplete information, which is the most charitable thing I can say. And I think that if your donkey has been identifying clay lens surface expressions consistently," he paused again with what might, in a man with more expressiveness, have been humor, "then he's doing something that I cannot explain scientifically, but that I have no evidence contradicting. I have seen water-finding dogs in my career. I have seen horses that wouldn't graze over bad ground. I am not in a position to categorically dismiss the donkey." Archimedes, who had been tied to the hitching post outside, chose this moment to make a sound. Not a bray exactly, more of an extended vocal consideration, the kind of low resonant tone that donkeys produce when they are communicating with themselves. All three of us looked toward the window. "What I think you should do," Pruitt continued, recovering his professional composure, "is not spend $400 you don't have on a survey that will confirm what I'm already fairly confident about. Instead, I think you should dig." "Dig where?" Pruitt put his finger on the northeast quadrant spot on the map. "Here, by hand if you have to, 8 to 12 feet down, angled into the clay lens. If what I'm reading from your samples is accurate, you'll hit moisture-bearing clay at depth within 2 weeks. If you hit nothing, you've wasted 2 weeks of labor. If you hit what I think is there," he stopped. "Then the question becomes what you do next." "What would you do next?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment that felt like a decision. "I would bring in a partner," he said. "Someone with capital and someone whose involvement would change the story that Pima Junction tells about this land. The story matters as much as the soil. People invest in stories." He folded his hands on the desk with the deliberateness of a man who has said more than he planned, and is now administering to himself a kind of professional propriety. "That's what I know and what I think," he said. "What will you do?" Elias Cutter stood up and extended one of those long-fingered hands across the desk. "I'll dig," he said. Pruitt shook his hand with a grip that was, I observed, considerably more engaged than I'd have predicted from a man of his restrained manner. "Come back when you find something," Pruitt said. "I'd like to know if I'm right." I stayed. That is the plain fact of it. I told Hargrove via letter that I was conducting a supplemental survey of basin subsurface formations, which was technically true, and then I pitched a tent at the northwest edge of Elias Cutter's 27 acres, which was technically not what supplemental surveys involved. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't object to my staying. We developed, over the following days, the wordless functional arrangement of two people working toward the same thing from different positions, me surveying and documenting, him digging. He dug the way he did everything, systematically, without dramatics, with a precision that belied the brutality of the physical work. Hand digging in desert ground is not romantic. The first foot is hardpan, baked into something close to ceramic by decades of sun. The second and third feet are looser but more treacherous, the kind of dirt that collapses unpredictably if you're not shoring as you go. Elias had read about shoring techniques in the Tucson library. He'd drawn diagrams in his notebook. He implemented them alone, with salvaged lumber he'd hauled out from town on Archimedes' back over 2 separate trips. I helped where I could. My survey work involved measuring and noting the relationship between the bore site and the surrounding topography, which legitimized my presence and kept my hands occupied when they itched to take the shovel. But some evenings, after the light went and Elias sat by the fire with his journal, I'd ask him questions. He was a better talker in the evening, not by much but by enough. He'd grown up in New Mexico territory. He told me, third child of a family that had been convinced by a promoter's pamphlet to relocate to a homestead that turned out to be exactly what Elias' land was currently accused of being: alkaline, waterless, hostile to cultivation. His family had lasted 4 years before giving up and moving to Albuquerque, where his father eventually found work in a warehouse, and his mother took in sewing. He never forgave himself for the land, Elias said one evening, staring at the fire with the flat steadiness of a man recounting something he'd processed until it no longer drew blood. For believing the pamphlet. He'd go over it again and again, what he should have known, what he should have tested, what he should have asked before he signed. "Is that why you research so thoroughly?" I asked. He looked up from the fire. Partly I just..." He paused with an unusually long deliberation. "I kept thinking, what if the problem wasn't the land? What if the problem was that nobody knew how to read it?" He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire. "What if the pamphlet people were using the wrong language?" I wrote that down later, Elias' theory. Not that the land was misrepresented, that it was misread, which is a different kind of problem and a different kind of hope. On the 9th day, Archimedes stopped at the bore site. He'd been grazing at his tether limit, working methodically through whatever the creosote and scrub offered him. And then at some point in the middle of the morning, he simply walked to the end of his tether in the direction of the bore hole, which was not in his grazing territory, and stood there with all 4 feet planted and both ears forward, at a posture of such deliberate attention that I put down my compass and walked over. The bore hole was at 9 feet now. Elias was working at the bottom of it, partially below sight. I could hear the rhythmic chunk of the shovel. Then the rhythm stopped. A silence long enough to mean something. "Cutter," I said. His voice came up from the hole, flat, controlled, carrying nothing. "Wet," he said. "One word. The kind of word that gets the job done." Archimedes made his low vocal sound, not a bray, that resonant inner-directed consideration. And I stood at the edge of the borehole in the Sonoran morning light and felt, without any professional or scientific justification, that something had just answered back. I sat down on the edge of the borehole, my feet dangling into the warmth below, and I wrote in my journal. Just 3 sentences, but I wrote them with the sense that they needed to be precise. Water at 9 feet, clay lens confirmed, the donkey was right. And underneath that, after a moment, when Elias climbed out of that hole, his face was completely neutral. That's how I knew how much it mattered. The evening of the 9th day, Elias sat at the fire for a very long time without writing in his journal, without checking his maps, without doing any of the methodical things he always did in the evenings. He sat and looked at the fire, and Archimedes stood at his shoulder in the particular companionable way that had stopped surprising me days ago. After an hour or so, I said, "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said. I didn't say anything. "He would have," Elias started, then stopped, started again. He needed this to be wrong, people like my father, the ones who tried and failed. They need the land to be genuinely worthless because the alternative, he stopped again. The alternative is that it was readable, I said. And they just didn't have the right language. Yes. The fire cracked. Archimedes shifted his weight. Is that comforting or not? I asked. He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. I don't know yet, he said. I'll tell you when I've figured it out. The thing about a story changing is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and find the world rearranged with clean edges and explanatory signage. What happens instead is slower and stranger, a gradual reorientation, like a river that shifts course not all at once but grain by grain over seasons, so that one day someone looks and says, "That's different," and has no clear memory of the moment it became so. The story of Elias Cutter's 27 acres changed like that. I was there for the beginning of the change, and I was there in fits and starts, returning to Pima Junction over the following 7 months on occasions that started as professional and became something else, for enough of the middle to report on it honestly. I was not there for the end. I'm not sure there was an end exactly. That's the nature of the kind of story where the land keeps talking long after the first conversation. What I can tell you is what I witnessed. That's all I've ever been good for. The water at 9 feet was, as Prewitt confirmed on his first actual site visit, exactly what he'd predicted from the clay lens analysis. He came out the morning after Elias' discovery. I'd sent word the previous evening by the fastest means available, which in Pima Junction meant paying a boy on a fast horse 50 cents. And he spent 4 hours at the bore site with instruments I hadn't seen him carry before, real survey equipment that he'd apparently kept in careful storage in his back room since retirement. He measured, he calculated. He went very quiet for about 20 minutes and then he said, "The lens extends southwest, approximately 40 yards at minimum, possibly 90. Elias said, "What does that mean in practical terms?" "In practical terms," Prewitt said, "it means this is not a novelty well. It means you have a subsurface water feature of significant scale running through the center of your property. And it means," he paused, and in the pause I heard him making a decision about how large to make his next statement, "that the alkalinity problem on the surface is not a permanent condition. It's a soil management problem, which has soil management solutions." "Gypsum amendment," Elias said. Prewitt looked at him. "I read the soil chemistry book again," Elias said. 4 times now. 5. Something crossed Prewitt's face that was unambiguously a smile, quickly governed. "Gypsum amendment, correct. In conjunction with irrigation from the subsurface well, which delivers lower alkalinity water than the surface reads, you have a remediation pathway. Slow, multi-year, not glamorous." But he looked at the sketch map spread on the crate, at the 11 sample bags, at the bore hole with the damp clay smell rising from it. Real. Real. That word did something in the air between the three of us. It wasn't dramatic. It was, in fact, very quiet, but it had a weight. I wrote it down, real. Prewitt said it like a verdict. The change in Pima Junction's story started at the water trough, which is where most important information in frontier towns began its circulation. Beale the postmaster told someone, and that someone told someone else. And within 3 days of the well discovery, there were 2 men from town who rode out to the property to look at the bore hole with the vaguely competitive curiosity of people who want to understand something before they're forced to admit they were wrong about it. Elias showed them the bore hole. He showed them the sample bags and the sketch maps. He showed them Prewitt's measurements. He didn't editorialize. He just showed them the evidence, the same way he'd been accumulating it for 8 months, with the patient precision of a man who has decided that the data will say what it says without help from him. They were not immediately converted. That would be too neat a version of events. One of the men, a large rancher named Alderson who ran cattle on the eastern ridge and had told Elias to his face, 3 months earlier, that the land was useful only as an object lesson in poor judgment, went home, and had what I was told was a significant private conversation with his wife that lasted until very late that evening. The other man, a merchant named Chavez, asked Elias what his plans were for the property. "Irrigation," Elias said. "For what crop?" "Not sure yet. The soil amendment takes time. I'm looking at varieties that do well in transitional alkalinity. Broom corn might be first, as a conditioning crop." After that, possibly fruit trees. Chavez looked at him with an expression that was recalibrating in real time. Fruit trees, he said. In the basin. Subsurface water in sufficient volume and at sufficient alkalinity reduction makes it possible, Elias said. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, without the triumphalism that the situation might have licensed. It'll take 3 to 5 years before anything commercially viable comes out of it. I'm not pretending otherwise. Chavez was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this from the start, he said. I've been planning for the possibility, Elias said. There's a difference. I think about that distinction a lot in the years since. The difference between planning from certainty and planning for possibility. The first is what confidence looks like from the outside. The second is what courage looks like from the inside, when no one can see the difference yet. Elias had spent 8 months doing something that, from the outside, looked like a man embarrassing himself. The dead-level patience of it. The monthly humiliations at the Assier's office. The 30-plus dismissals he'd stopped counting. The camp on the alkaline scrubland with the too elaborate filing system, and the donkey with the philosophical bearing, and the ability to locate what human measurement had failed to find. From the inside, I later understood, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a man who had watched his father mourn a wrong conclusion for 19 years, and had decided that the only thing worse than failing was failing without having actually looked. He had looked, that was all, just thoroughly without flinching. The Alderson conversation, the one that lasted late into the night between the rancher and his wife, produced, eventually, a proposal. Alderson came to Elias' camp 2 weeks after the borehole discovery, and sat down on a rock across from the fire ring with the somewhat uncomfortable posture of a large man, unused to the specific discomfort of making amends. I want to invest, he said, in the property as a partner. Elias looked at him without expression. I was wrong, Alderson said. He said it with the particular compressed directness of a man who had practiced the sentence and was delivering it before he could modify it. About the land. I'm not saying I was unreasonable, the surface reads were. You don't have to explain the reasoning, Elias said. What are the terms you're proposing? It was a mercy, actually, the way he said it, cutting off the justification before it could extend into something that would require a more emotional response from both of them. Elias understood, I think he'd always understood, that the men who dismissed him had not been malicious. They'd been working with incomplete information, the same as everyone always was. The question was never really whether they'd been wrong. The question was what they would do about it now. The terms were discussed. I wasn't present for that conversation, having gone to file my actual survey amendments finally, but Elias described it to me later. A capital investment for a 40% partnership stake, which would fund the gypsum amendment, the proper bore casing, and the initial irrigation infrastructure. And you accepted, I said. After I talked to Prewitt about whether the terms were reasonable, Elias said. What did Prewitt say? He said Alderson was getting the better end of the deal, but that the capital was necessary, and that pride was a luxury for men with more options. That sounds like Prewitt. He also said, Elias paused. He was doing something with a length of rope, coiling it with the same methodical attention he applied to sample bags. He said that Alderson's involvement would change the story the town told. That was the phrase he used. The story the town tells. He said it mattered as much as the soil chemistry. And did it change the story? Elias looked up from the rope. What do you think? I thought about Beale the postmaster and his 2-fingered envelope delivery. I thought about the woman with the basket who turned slightly as Elias passed. I thought about the 30-plus dismissals and the form letter from the university. Yes, I said, I think it did. People are complicated, Elias said without judgment. They need a threshold. Once Alderson was involved, there was a threshold. It became possible to take the thing seriously without, he paused, without having been the first one to take it seriously. He finished coiling the rope and set it aside. That's not weakness, he said. That's just how groups work. You can resent it or you can use it. My father resented it. I'd rather use it. The full soil amendment program took 2 years to show meaningful results, which is the realistic timeline and not the story that gets told in the condensed version. The first growing season produced the broom corn Elias had mentioned, Not beautiful, not profitable, but alive. Things were alive on the 27 acres. This was not a small thing. Archimedes continued his rounds. This is the part of the story that people in Pima Junction in subsequent years would retell with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. The donkey who'd found the water. The donkey who'd known what the Asyrs didn't. The donkey who'd walked 27 acres of worthless desert and found the places where the earth remembered water. I have my own version of it, the one from my journal entries, which is more precise and less romantic, but which I think is actually more extraordinary for its specificity. Archimedes had not been doing anything magical. What he'd been doing was what donkeys and many animals do in arid environments, following the subtle chemical and thermal signatures that clay-rich, moisture-retaining ground produces at the surface, signs too faint for human sensory equipment to register, but within the range of an animal whose survival has historically depended on locating water in exactly these conditions. He'd been reading the land in the language that the land spoke, which was not the language of the assay report or the deed survey or the territorial office's classification system. He'd been reading it the way it needed to be read. And Elias had noticed. That was all. He'd noticed and he'd recorded and he'd trusted the observation long enough to test it. The observing and the trusting and the not stopping, that was the whole story. I went back to Pima Junction in September of the year after the borehole discovery, on actual professional business this time, and I walked out to the property on my first free morning because I needed to see it. The irrigation channels were modest but real, hand-dug, stone-lined, carrying subsurface water from the bore well across the northeast quadrant and down into the amended soil. The gypsum treatment had changed the color of a significant patch of ground from the bleached, cracked white-gray of alkali-heavy earth to something darker, more loam-like, with a texture that absorbed light differently. Things were growing in it. Not extensively, not yet, but specifically, the calculated, deliberate growth of a plan being executed on its actual timeline. Elias was there, doing what he was always doing, which was something methodical with a focused expression and a notebook nearby. He was older-looking in the way that productive outdoor work makes people older-looking, not depleted, but defined. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes, and his hands had gone even more extraordinary, if that was possible, with the specific callousing of someone who has dug 9 feet into desert ground by hand, and then spent a year building infrastructure with those same hands. Archimedes was there too, working his way along the irrigation channel edge with the same philosophical completeness. His rogue ear was doing its independent thing. "September looks different out here," I said, stopping at the edge of the amended patch. "Everything looks different out here," Elias said, without looking up from what he was noting in the notebook. "The broom corn's down. Harvested 3 weeks ago, we turned it under. The organic matter helps the amendment." I said, "Alderson's working it. 2 of his men on a schedule, and Prewitt comes out on Tuesdays." He finally looked up, registering my expression. "I know. Prewitt comes out on Tuesdays. He says it's a professional interest in observing the clay lens remediation in real time. But he also," Elias paused with a micro-expression that was as close as he got to amusement, "he brings his lunch and stays until late afternoon." I looked at the land, at the irrigation channels and the darkened soil and the specific aliveness of a place that was changing from one thing into another. "Are you happy?" I said, and then felt immediately that the question was too large and too personal, and I was about to retract it when Elias answered. "I'm engaged," he said. "That's the closest thing I know to happiness." He went back to his notebook. Archimedes arrived at my feet and stood there, both ears forward, and looked at me with the considered patience of an animal who has been waiting for humans to figure something out and has developed, in the long waiting, a quality of acceptance that is neither resignation nor contentment, but something between them that I don't have a precise word for. I put my hand on his neck, the way Elias had at the hitching post in town on that first day, the automatic gesture that isn't performing affection because it doesn't need to. And then I opened my journal, same as I always do, and I wrote down what I saw. I wrote a lot of things in that journal over the 2 years I visited the property. Most of them were observations. Some of them were technical notes, geological and hydrological, that I later included in an actual supplemental survey report that Hargrove received with suspicious surprise and filed without comment. But the last entry I made on the final visit was different. It wasn't a technical note. It wasn't even really an observation. It was something closer to a conclusion, which I don't usually allow myself because conclusions are where the approximation starts. I wrote the land was never worthless, it was unread. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and the person who knows the difference and refuses to collapse one into the other, who insists on reading rather than judging, is either a fool or the only rational actor in the room, and the only way to tell which is to wait long enough for the data to come in. Elias waited, Archimedes waited. The clay lens, considerably less patiently, had been waiting since the Pleistocene. I asked Elias once whether he ever wanted to go back to that moment at the county auction and say something to the man who'd laughed when he bid on the land. He thought about it for a long time. No, he said. Why not? Because they weren't wrong about what they could see. They were wrong about what they couldn't see. And the best response to that isn't an argument, it's a well. Archimedes lived for 9 more years after the borehole discovery. In the local oral tradition of Pima Junction, he became one of those figures that communities build around useful legends. The donkey who knew, the animal who read the unreadable, the creature who made a fool of every expert in the county, and then stood there looking philosophical about it. Elias never encouraged this version of the story and never corrected it either. He just noted, when asked, that Archimedes had done what animals do in dry country, followed what he could sense, and that the lesson, if there was one, was to pay attention to things that are doing their job well even when you don't understand the job. I think about that sometimes, about all the things doing their jobs in ways we don't have the language to read yet, about the distance between worthless and unread, and how much depends on whether you're willing to dig 9 feet to find out which word applies. About a man with a notebook and 11 sample bags and an independent-tiered donkey on 27 acres of desert that the county sold for $25.11. About the 11 cents. About how a man who counts every coin he has is also, necessarily, a man who counts everything else. The well produced water for 23 years before the property changed hands. By then, the amended soil had been extended to 18 of the 27 acres and was producing regularly. The story Pima Junction told about the land had changed so completely that the people who'd been loudest in calling it worthless had, in the way of such things, arranged their memories into a shape where they'd been more equivocal than they actually were. This is also human. I wrote it down without judgment. Elias sold the property at 54. He moved somewhere else. I lost track of him after a few years, the way you lose track of people you've known at a specific angle rather than head-on. But the last time I saw him, at the property on a morning in late spring, he was standing at the northeast quadrant well with his notebook and Archimedes at his shoulder, and he was making a note about something in the water level, and his expression was the expression of a man entirely occupied with what's in front of him. The most dangerous thing he'd ever done, maybe, was let himself be right. Or maybe the most dangerous thing was the moment before that, the moment at the county auction when he raised his hand and everyone laughed, and he kept his hand raised. I don't know which to call the braver act. I only know he did both.